You're listening to Heather McCain.
Hi, this is Heather. Welcome back this week. So, this week I was having a conversation with my 13-year-old son. And it's so interesting because I really noticed that, dynamics change so much with each generation. And with this generation, it really seems as kind of what's called Generation Alpha, that they have this, different perspective about sort of gender fluidity. And I know that that is sort of such a touchy kind of conversation for so many people, especially Gen X and millennial, that were really kind of put into these parameters of what's boy and what's girl. And he was just kind of talking to me about how his favorite color was pink and what that represented. And I think it's so interesting. It really made me think of this sort of deeper spiritual principle, which is the law of gender, right? It's technically the 12th law of the universe. And it's this idea that we both have this sort of feminine and masculine qualities in us, and that regardless of our gender, it's this sort of separate thing that, we have them both existent in us. And so I just thought it was so interesting as we were having this conversation about these parameters that really society puts on people, right? Pink isn't for girl or for boy. It's just a color. And if you like that color, that's great. And it just made me think about how we do that to ourselves spiritually all the time. Instead of letting two things kind of coexist inside us, like our masculine and our feminine, it's become this big culture war about how women should be this and men should be this, or you should be this and perceive things this way. And I understand this in such a deep personal way because in my own marriage, I have sort of separate of what typical gender roles are, where I'm the working parent. My husband does what's more kind of considered the feminine principles of like laundry and cooking and taking the children places. And I think that this week, when I was sort of thinking about how we all feel like we have to fit in this box, that it's really important to remember that it's literally a spiritual principle that you're just supposed to honor whatever kind of comes to you authentically. So, as I was having this conversation with my son, I was thinking how it could really apply to all of us. That the reality of the situation is that, feminine or masculine or athletic or musical or whatever proponents come naturally to us, we should feel like we can express and that we don't have to fit in any kind of one parameter.
And now's a portion of the show where Heather takes calls, emails, and letters from followers and listeners and applies spiritual principles to them to answer their questions. So, Heather, we have a question from one of our listeners, and they're asking, how do you protect your energy without becoming cold?
Yeah. So protecting your energy without becoming cold is a complicated thing because ultimately, to truly protect your energy, it means you pull it within yourself. And a lot of times people associate that with sort of shutting yourself off to other people, which in fact means cold. But the reality is you can energetically not absorb what somebody's giving to you and still engage with them. So I think that the real component is, and I know that this is going to sound bizarre, but when you're talking to another human being, you can probably feel yourself feeling it in your chest. So you absorb energy kind of from your what's called your heart chakra. And so the greatest way when you're sort of trying to communicate with someone else and you don't want to sort of absorb their energy, you want to disengage with what they're saying, right? So you don't want to take anything they're saying personally because that automatically is going to make you absorb. So if there's a reason why you're protecting your energy, first off, you want to make sure to kind of disconnect in that way. And then secondly, you want to not absorb anything in your chest. So you really want to focus on sort of absorbing their energy through your head. And I know that sounds bizarre, but it's the easiest way. You also want to be careful about who you allow yourself to be around. And there's a real component of, emotionally, if you feel someone's energy, instead of holding on to it, you want to perceive it like a leaf going down the river. So you energetically, you feel what they're saying, but then you consciously release it. And I think being a little cold is okay if you're protecting yourself.
All right, Heather. So we have another message from one of our followers, and they're asking, why do empaths attract narcissistic dynamics?
This is a really good question because it's just this universal truth. People who are incredibly empathic seem to really gravitate narcissistic people to them, whether that's in romantic relationships or within workplace dynamics. It seems as if many times the empath is sort of the victim of the narcissist. And I would say the most simplistic answer, even though, it is more nuanced when you get into it, but the really simple answer is because by nature, an empath is a giver. And by nature, a narcissist is a taker. And so that is sort of the fundamental component. Now, it certainly gets more nuanced in the fact that the reality is many times for kind of this narcissistic game to work, especially a covert narcissist, right, who likes to kind of victimize people, then flip the switch and be the victim of the person's response. An empath is a really good person to do that with, right? Because you are so empathic in regards to trying to see things from other people's perspective. You are so deeply rooted in the idea of accountability and respecting other people's feelings that even when the person's feelings are actually orchestrated in this narcissistic, manipulative way, you're going to see their perspective. You're going to kind of feed, sort of be their narcissistic source. You'll kind of feed into this idea of like, I'm sorry that I hurt you. And so, an empath is a easy target for a narcissist because they're so compassionate and because they're givers.
So Heather, we have another question here. And this person is asking, what does energetic stewardship mean in my life?
So I like the language of this question, right? Because energetic stewardness makes you think of financial stewardness, right? And it's sort of the same principle. If you're being sort of financially intelligent, you really are careful about where you put out your money. Well, the same goes with energy, right? The key to kind of being a good steward of your own energy is to really mark where you put it. And the kind of simplest way to do that is, does this serve me? Regardless if it's sort of getting upset because of a customer service person, if it's getting upset because of an in-law relationship, or whether or not it's putting energy into somebody who maybe isn't deserving, you want to perceive your energy as a gift. And you only want to outsource so much as it will serve you back. So if I'm in a situation with customer service and I can't control anything, I can only get upset, but it isn't going to mark any kind of difference. Part of the way that I would be able to be a good steward of my energy is by respecting the fact that this is unchangeable. If I'm in a situation that I can change, being a good steward of my energy would be meeting level 2 problems with the level 2 response. And so you wouldn't pay $50 for something that costs $5. And so the greatest way that we hurt ourselves with our energy is sort of putting it out based off of emotion and not based off of sort of meeting the situation or the event. And so interestingly enough, I think the most simplistic answer is regulation. Regulation is the greatest way to be a good steward of your energy and sort of matching the situation and only putting energy into things that will serve you. So if there's a person who's energetically draining, who you're not going to be able to change the dynamic, then you would be a good steward of your energy by no longer kind of engaging with that person. And so I think the two main components are to choose wisely who you exchange or put energy into. Only choose situations which you're absolutely able to impact with your reactions or with your energy. And then to always regulate and have your energy be based off of kind of the level of the situation and not the level of your feelings.
All right, Heather. So I have an emailer here and they kind of want you to get a read on them a little bit here. And so they want to know, do they confuse compassion with responsibility?
Well, listen, I think that in this specific circumstance, the answer is yes. I think that it's something that people often do. I think that the reality is there are certain people who have what's called a healing energy, and it's certainly the case for this person. And so when you feel something in regards to an injustice, there's a desire to sort of make it right. And people tend to gravitate towards certain types of people, these healing energies with that sort of expectation. The problem is if they have that type of expectation, you energetically feel that you're a healer anyway, then you often want to sort of take this on. And I understand this in a deeply personal way because I am that type of person as well. And I think that the reality is that you can have compassion for others. You can show up with your capacity without sort of having this energetic responsibility. Because the complication when you feel responsible for someone else's experience or feelings, and then you absorb that, there's this component of taking on things that are not meant for you. And so not only does people start to feel that you owe them this obligation, but you're energetically draining yourself in a way that's then being disrespectful to yourself, because ultimately you only have a limited amount of resources. While I believe showing up for other human beings is the most important part of our human experience, part of that is showing up for yourself. And so you can have compassion for others without making their problem something that you have to fix.
So, Heather, this message comes from a follower of yours, and they want to know, is their sensitivity a wound? Is it a gift? Or is it both?
That is a really good question. And like all things, it's complicated and nuanced. But, at the root, the answer is if sensitivity is a gift, and the answer is yes. No matter how you've received it, to be hypersensitive means that you're aware of your own feelings and the feelings of others. That's what sensitivity is at its core. And there's no way that you slice that it's a bad thing. But in some cases, it is born of wound. There are two ways that you can become an empath. And an empath is sort of the next level of sensitivity. You have a hypersensitive people, and then when you escalate that, you have empaths. And obviously people who are born with empathy, it looks different than people who've developed it. Much like, certain people can get very good at piano, but that's different than being born as a prodigy. You kind of start at a level where you're able to get to higher than sort of if you weren't sort of born with it. But the reality of the situation is that wounds, right? So going through very severe things, whether that's trauma, whether it's neglect, whether it's most of the time it's created by having someone who's unregulated when you're a child. So you're constantly having to sort of hone into that gift because you have your well-being is dependent on if they're okay. So you're constantly having to sort of, hone in that gift so that you can kind of react in a way that makes you safer as a child. So I think that the answer is both. If you're asking this question in this way, I would assume that it's rooted in a wound. But even if it's rooted in a wound, it's still a gift.
Heather, here's another question for you. This one comes from a listener, and they want to know, does fear block you from trusting yourself?
So it's so interesting when people with spiritual gifts, so intuitives or empaths, do any type of training. The first component that you focus on is differentiating your intuition with fear. Because the reality of the situation is fear is the strongest emotion that we can feel. Secondly, after that is jealousy. And so many times people interpret their fear as intuition. And the greatest way usually to differentiate that is by going with your first emotional response, because it does feel very similar. And I think that if you're in a situation where you already are analytically very scared of something and sort of made a decision about something, those are the hardest things to sort of intuitively connect to. It's why a lot of times people with a really high level of gift to professionally do readings don't trust reading themselves because it's really hard to differentiate. My skill set and the way that I've been trained and the way I differentiate fear from my own sort of anxiety is two things. One is your intuition is always going to feel calm and it's always going to come to you immediately. So if you had to pick one tool how to differentiate, I would say that would be the best one. Whatever comes to you first. And then even if it's a flip second later to try to disassociate with that, because that is something else usually rooted in fear. Something else that I found in my own personal experience is I tend to feel intuition or sort of like that energetic download from the head chakra, where fear always kind of is created in sort of the chest, or what's considered the heart chakra. And so if you're feeling it in your chest, if you can feel kind of tenseness, and if it's something that wasn't your initial thought process, but something that you immediately came to, that's usually how you can tell that it's fear. But ultimately, I mean, that is one of the great complications. And it's something that some people who do this for a living and have done it for living for a long time still have to kind of focus on and try to differentiate, because fear does feel a lot like intuition.
So Heather, this is the Dear Heather portion of the show. This is where we receive letters from people who are listening. And I felt like this one was a really good one for you. So this one says, Dear Heather, I can't stop checking my partner's location or social media. I hate that I do it. It makes me feel crazy, but when I stop, I feel panicky. How do I break this cycle?
Well, I think that first off, you shouldn't shame yourself, because this is more normal than you think. But the reality is even the language you used in this question, this is clearly rooted in a wound. And so what you have to realize when you have to do a behavior that you know is irrational, or you would feel embarrassed if you knew other people were aware of it, you always have to realize that ultimately that means it's rooted in something deeper. So I think the real answer ultimately to this would be to heal the part of you that either has an abandonment wound or that feels that you're not chosen, the part of you that maybe experienced some kind of trauma in regards to somebody not doing or being where they said they would. I think in this particular circumstance, it's an abandonment wound. It's a fear that this person is fear-based about not being enough. And so that then creates the irrational logic that this person's partner must be doing something because they're not enough. And so then you're projecting that. And so you need to feel this reassurance because of your own wound, not because this person's done anything that isn't trustworthy, not because you actually even have an issue with this person, but because you've so fundamentally decided that you aren't enough and that it doesn't make sense and that you're not worthy of this person, that your subconscious has created a narrative that they're seeking someone else out, and then you're acting on that. And so the real solution is to process and heal those wounds, which many times can be done in journaling. I believe personally that therapy is incredibly helpful with that kind of healing, because the reality is that kind of behavior will always eventually sabotage your life, because even though it's an interpersonal thing that you're doing, you're projecting it onto someone else. And if they catch you, those are grounds to ruin a relationship, because they will feel as if you don't trust them. They haven't done anything that was worthy of not being trusted. And in reality, it's really just rooted in you feeling you're not enough.
Well, Heather, I think we have time for another one. We have another letter from a listener. And so for this portion of the show, I think this would be perfect. So let's read it right now. It says, I'm a mom and I feel like I'm failing because I'm exhausted all the time. I love my kids, but I have nothing left. How do I recharge when life doesn't pause?
I can relate to this question so much as a mom, right? And I think that the reality is this idea of mom guilt, where you have this extremely important role that's incredibly emotionally demanding, and it is energetically draining. And the complication is, especially if you kind of never have time, is how do I take care of me while also feeling like I'm not taking away from my children, while also being in a position, if I don't do that, where I'm energetically drained and I feel like I'm failing all the time. And, I think that a lot of times the word self-care gets a really bad rap, and it should, the way some people represent it, because it's usually associated with, doing the nails, which it's time consuming, and not everyone has the finances for getting your hair done, going and taking little trips. But that's not what self-care is, right? True self-care is doing small practices that allow you to replenish yourself so that you can vibrate energetically at a level that is sustainable and healthy for you. And Now, this is where it gets a little bit more complicated because it's really individually based. But in regards to this person particularly, I think self-care involves doing small things that replenish you that you enjoy, as well as energetic things that allow you to process your own feelings. So I think journaling for moms is really important. It allows you to give time for yourself while also giving yourself the time to process your own experiences, because I think one of the most energetic draining things is not hold emotional space for you. I think a lot of times little more typical self-care things like taking baths, which is an energy cleanse, or even a hot shower where you're giving yourself time alone. But the most important thing for moms, and I say this to my clients, I say this to my twin sister, I say this to myself, you really cannot replenish if you're in someone else's energy space. And so taking time where you're in a room alone, which is very hard to do because a lot of times as a mom, you don't even go to the restroom by yourself, but taking time where you are not in an energy exchange with anyone and you're able to sit with yourself, whether that's watching TV or journaling or reading a book, is really the easiest way to replenish. But I also know these are simplistic answers because being a parent is incredibly difficult and it's the highest level of energy exchange. And so I think finding little things that you can do. I also personally have really found to clear energy, I really like essential oils. And so I think lavender and wild orange, if you can get a candle with those scents or you can take baths with those scents, those are very replenishing, certainly in regards to the sort of, we have these energetic reserves, and the one that's sort of associated with motherhood, where you're kind of giving that very maternal energy out, that replenishes it as well.
This is the portion of the show we like to call Soul Talk. This is where I get to talk to Heather about things going on in our lives, things going on around us, and have Heather apply spiritual principles to them. Heather, we just had the Super Bowl. I know you probably watched it because I know Luke was watching it. So there's a lot of things going on with that, though. There was more going on than the football game. And so I wanted to bring this to you today and talk to you about the divide that is going on. And we don't have to get too political, but I think spiritually this is so important, don't you?
I couldn't agree more, because I think that the divisiveness that exists through this really is the sort of deeper spiritual principle. And it's so interesting when you kind of brought up about talking about this, because I'm a huge reality TV person, right? And so there was a Real Housewife of New York. So she had gotten fired many years ago, rallied another network to kind of start this new show of like the original housewives. This woman has worked for 15 years to get this show on the air. She got it on E, sort of like the New York Housewives legends. And then she got on social media and she said a very kind of racist rant about how it was the worst Super Bowl ever, that it was disrespectful with 250 years, and that, because of this, that she thought it was a political statement and there were no white people. And because she said this, she lost her job. And the reason why I bring up that story is because I think that it's so interesting. We so much live in sort of our teams and our sides that we can't see the way we think we're so right in our perspective that we can't see that we're doing something that's going to hurt us. And so, I think it's very sad about how divisive it is. And ultimately, I feel like, because people are so wounded sort of politically, they're kind of clinging to sides. And unfortunately, this has turned into a side thing.
Heather, the thing is about it is, what we were referring to is they had different halftime shows, and so people started drawing their lines in the sand. I even post, I usually don't do this, but I got on social media. I try not to because I know what I'm going to get from this, but I posted afterwards after seeing all the negative responses to Bad Bunny and all this is, since when do we have to understand the words to appreciate the music and the performance?
I love that.
Why do we have to? When we go to the ballet or when we go to all these, when have we ever had to understand the words to understand the art?
Right. No, I love that. And I love that from your perspective as a musician, because I couldn't agree more. And to even take that sort of one step further, it does people seem to forget that, we don't have a national language in this country. And that man on that stage sang as an American because Puerto Ricos are Americans. He could come live in Nebraska right now. He could go live in California. And so it just goes to show that not only do people, they can't just sit in the music, but you're not entitled necessarily to understand the language, and people feel like they are entitled. But this country does not have a national language.
Well, and I think the tie-in here that is that I want to know from you, Heather, is I know that you can feel the emotion of all of this. I know that you can feel it on such a deep level. And so it's got to be hard for you, but how does one navigate with all of this negativity going on around them? How does one get through it spiritually now?
That's such a beautiful question. And I think that interestingly enough, he kind of gave the answer in that performance, right? I didn't understand it either, but I was curious to know what he was saying. And so I looked it up, which any person could have done, right? It's not that hard to find translations that would have communicated with them. But the answer is love. I think that the reality is that the deepest spiritual principle is that we're divided, and that the number one spiritual concept, right, of the 12 laws of the universe, the first one is divine oneness, which means we're all so deeply interconnected. And so if we stop focusing on what differentiates us, and it seems right now language and color of the skin are really a huge proponent of what people are holding on to with identity, if you can really release that and allow yourself to know that we're all interconnected, that those things don't differentiate us, and stop using them in a way where, there's this divide. And I think, and I'm sure you've seen this too, Kane, the rise of hate, I feel like, is very high. And I think that is the real sign that we've gotten away from this divine oneness, this rise of not only, oh, I don't understand Spanish, I hate anyone who speaks Spanish. Oh, like, I wish the Super Bowl was in English. I hate anyone who disagrees with me. And then that's where we have to create our own thing, because we're so sort of turned off by this idea. And that's what makes it offensive. The reality is it's okay if you didn't like that the Super Bowl halftime show was in Spanish, but sometimes we all have to sit in things that we don't like. It doesn't mean that we get to create our own version of reality.
Well, for me, it cuts deeply because, on my mom's side is Hispanic. If it wasn't for, my grandmother coming over from Mexico and being an immigrant herself, there would not be me here, right? And she had such a wonderful, she was a beautiful lady. She had such a wonderful experience. I mean, she came to rural Nebraska. She lived down by Beatrice. She became the postmaster there. I mean, she had such a beautiful life, and she was such an amazing person. And none of that would have happened had the American dream not been realized. So I take it very personal when I hear this stuff, because I feel like you're spitting in my ancestors' face.
I couldn't agree more. That gives me chills, by the way, that what you just said. But I agree. I also come from immigrants who came here illegally, because it was illegal for Jews to come here. And I'm proud of the fact that I came from a lineage of brave people. And it sounds like you came from a lineage of brave people as well. And, I certainly understand the idea of following rules, and I agree. But I think that everything is so nuanced. And so we need to be careful about not judging each other. And we're all technically immigrants.
We are. And I mean, I'll even take it a step further. I had a situation, a high stress situation, where I was parked at my kid's school. I'm just parked there, and I got backed into by a person, and that's a high stress situation. But then as I tried to communicate with him, it became very apparent that the language barrier, he was Russian, and neither of us could communicate with each other at all. We tried, and it was an interesting situation. My son was standing there, and I thought, this is a great time to teach him a lesson on how to be compassionate to people when you don't know, when you can't understand what they're saying, when they can't understand what you're saying. And so I kept my cool, I kept my calm. I tried to be extremely respectful to them and just get through the situation. And it paid off in dividends. I mean, they admitted to the fault of what happened. There was no issue whatsoever with the accident, and we went along our day. So if anything, Heather, I feel like the universe was teaching me a lesson, and in turn, me getting to teach my son a lesson.
Oh, I love that, Kane. I love that. And that is one of the more stressful situations you can find yourself in, because obviously our vehicles in life are one of the most expensive things we own. And so it feels very vulnerable. But I mean, just even connecting to that situation, the reality is you realizing in that moment that you needed to handle it that way. Not only did you ground in what you knew and who you wanted to be, not only did you get to teach your son a lesson, Kane, but also the way that it connects. If you hadn't have handled it that way, you wouldn't have gotten that outcome. And so ultimately, the fact that you sort of took this high road, you kind of treated this person as a human being instead of kind of being dysregulated and coming from the energy of anger, is why this was able to end for you in a positive way. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. And as you go through this week, I would just ask that you remember that all people are really, for the most part, trying to do the best that they can. And when you're in a position where you're constantly looking for what you dislike about someone, that's all you're going to see, right? It's much like if I tell you to look at every red item in the room and to count each red item, you'll be able to tell me exactly how many red items are in a room. But if I say how many blue items in the room, you're not going to know. And so for this week, I would say, as you go through your journey, continue to look for the blue. Keep looking for the good things in others and good things around you, because gratitude reciprocates. I hope you have a great week.